Days and nights on the fishing boat as it worked its way south down the east coast were comfortingly monotonous for Osrith, and more than once she had been grateful for the splash of the waves or the flap of the oiled cloth sail which soothed her senses. Journeying with fishermen had been a clever plan, Osrith told herself, for the retreat to a functional world of nets, piles of fish corpses. Trading between ships meant she was no longer tied to the land and, consequently, to a lord, and her paying for passage was enough to get her left alone as Gert and Ulf, the Frisian fishermen, went about their trade. Though they were passing through Danish sea lanes, the fisher boat was barely challenged at any port in which they landed down the east coast. It did not stop at Bibbenberg, much to Osrith's relief. Gert had tried to explain, as far as Osrith understood, that their presence was unwelcome, and she was relieved when they skirted past the high fortress of her former home, armed as it had been in the days of her memory when she had fled, by ranks of bowmen aiming belligerently at the boat. Once Jiram was in sight, Osrith had breathed easier and had continued to unpick the fishing lines, a job which Ulf had abandoned to pull the sheet of the sail which sped it along the coast. Gert and his brother Ulf spoke Frisian to one another, which was difficult to understand, though they got by in English with Osrith. It was clear Ulf did not much like Osrith and would bar her way when the crates of salted herring were loaded in board, something for which Osrith was grateful, for the stench was truly awful. On a few mornings, Osrith had awoken under her blankets to a low argument between the brothers, which she gathered, by Ulf's sharp gesticulating in her direction, he disagreed with his brother's decision for her to be aboard. Further, that Ulf had wanted to prevent her from working on the boat. But she continued to mend their nets, clean the boat, in fact anything Osrith was not prevented from doing by the elder brother, which kept her mind off Alba. Of Alba and Domhnall and Constantine. Of Eric and Siegfried, and whoever has won the battle before done not as keep like walls. Of Domhnall and Senid and Tagged. Most of all Tagged, whose face would skip into her mind's eye as they skirted south around the east coast of the land, trading fish, as Gert's skilled handling of his boat reminded Osrith of Tagged's easy proficiency, of how he had brought them round the Galloway headland to Caeligwylid, past jagged rock formations hidden just below the surface of the sea which might otherwise have scuppered a less talented captain. Osrith's chest pained when she thought Tagged. She had come to love him, almost without realizing it until he had said so too, and had been determined to make a life with him. For him to die in that burning church was horrific. And yet, they had barely been in one another's company, and, Osrith had to admit, she had hardly been faithful since she had spoken the hand-wed oath that summer's day with the Morrigan present around them. Though, she had when it counted, Osrith told herself. When she had realized that she wanted to be his wife entirely, she had done. As had Tagged. But it had been too late, the promises they had made one another before the battle were for all too brief a time. Spray from the dipping boat splashed into her face as Gert's boat inched ever southwards, and Osrith focused on the movement to quell her yearning for what could now not be, a life with Tagged of Doyle, gone, in flames. And now she was gone. It was a thing of Aryan, Osrith knew, Gaelish, or pagan. It was well documented at the Armaka and Doyle monasteries, one of many things Andra the novice monk had explained to her once, to be an abomination, so Osrith guessed it must have been Druid. To fast against someone was a serious thing, to withdraw all sustenance as a protest was grave and serious. The longer it went on, the more pressure there was from the wrongdoer to put right the wrong that the person fasting was accusing them of. And she was doing that, Osrith thought, as they bobbed towards the wide estuary of Haig, Ulf hailing the fisher boats to their bows for trading, not with food but with labor. Domhnall valued her for her worth as a peace cow, and had known, as King presumably had known, that she was of Bernicia, of Bibbenberg, and had exploited that. Osrith could see that now. So she was gone, withdrawing herself from the agreement they had made. Yet, she had sworn to Domhnall, Osrith knew so very deeply, as she skimmed the water with her hand once the fishing boat was once again under way, sworn loyalty. Really, that meant she should have remained. That was one thing, Osrith told herself, the resolution forming within herself stronger with ever passing sea mile, she would never again bend her knee in loyalty to any king, any prince or any lord. She would fight for money, not loyalty. And she had very nearly married, too. Never would she marry. That left just one thing, Uhtred. He was her brother, who she last knew to be in the kingdom of Wessex. Uhtred, and also Father Ebeke were both in this kingdom, undefiled as it was by the Danes. She wanted so very badly to see him and Beke. Yet, she was well aware that they had both left her to her fate. Whatever she did, Osrith knew, she must be careful not to end up as his responsibility, for then, her life would be his to direct. Flounder was Osrith's travelling companion when the fishing boat had passed mist-shrouded islands on England's south coast, and she shifted to one side of the boat, the place she slept now half filled with fish, and closed her eyes again. Gert shook her carefully by the shoulder and pointed a long wide finger to the coast, mouthing the word, Wessex, before standing back, waiting for her to sit up. She yawned, and blinked at the coast again. Yet, as Osrith looked, there was a Danish warship tied up at a wharf. She felt to her waist, 2 weapons, both from Irishmen, under her hand. Tagd had passed her his Sikhs before he perished in flame. Domnall, from whom she had won Buie, would be there, beside his cousins, loyally waiting out his exile in Domnall's service. She resented the cowardly way she had run, and gripped her weapons in repentance. "Danes?" she asked, as Gert reached towards that morning's catch. She pointed out to the harbour. The Frisian turned his sunburnt face towards the vessel, his floppy blonde hair bouncing in the early morning breeze. "Yes, Danes," he nodded, handing Osrith the morning's net to unfasten. She let go of her weapons and took the net. Ulf scowled at her, but the sun was arcing higher that morning, and as it shone the warmth on her face made Osrith happy, and she watched the trading ships at the mouth of the river as their crews unloaded and unloaded, and one raised its square, striped sails. It took much of the morning for it to get under way, its prow carved with a dragon head, and at its stern wooden stems in the shape of wings. Osrith watched it as it left the harbour, only realizing its proximity as its wake washed out where the Frisian fishing boat had anchored. Only then, her heart began to beat faster, as Danes, fur-clad, arm-ringed, long-haired, fastened their vessel to girts. Several Danes hustled to the side, taking their eyes over the contents of the boat, taking in the nets and pots, the fish and line, and they jostled and pushed to begin a trade until one Dane, older than the men at the edge, heaved them out of the way, stamping a first trapped foot onto Gert's boat. Neither Frisian had answered the Danes' demands for trade, and Osrith had wondered whether that knew to the Danish language, or the Danes Frisian. But she realized as the Dane hefted himself into the boat that neither fisherman had answered, because they had been waiting for this man, to thrust his hand in into Ulf's, and clapped Gert on the back. "Hestin. Hestin," Ulf declared as he pointed to the lobster pots which they would use when they summered down towards Cornwall and Devonshire, and at the wide nets they used for trail fishing. Much of the catch that was being stored in buckets was crab, which had come from trade down the east coast, and the Dane Hestin had set about negotiating with Ulf for whiting, sole and herring as well as all their crab. He patted Ulf on arm as he scoured the stock and found what he liked, his arm round Ulf's shoulder as Gert folded his thick arms, watching them. Osrith cast a glance at the Danes, who were watching their leader as intently. Then, Heston's hand rested on something which Gert immediately betrayed to be valuable by taking a frantic step in its direction, the cloth bag in which Osrith had given Gert the silver as payment for her passage. Heston laughed, running grubby fingers through his braided hair, as he clutched the bag, then turned up Ulf, who looked straight at Osrith. The conversation was too quick for Osrith to follow, and where was the going to hide if she understood it anyway? Instead, she stared back at Ulf, shifting her fingers under her blanket to Tagd Sikhs, the swell of the waves moving backwards and forwards, making Osrith's mind link back directly to the Foyle estuary and her near drowning. She moved her hand down Buie, too, picturing Domnall, Prince of the Uineel, as Heston's eyes examined her body. Then, Osrith gripped Tagd Sikh's handle as Ulf pulled her up from the bench at the stern of the boat by the shoulder, shaking her free of the covering and holding onto her arm tightly as Heston looked her up and down, then back to the silver. The rest was secreted within her clothes, Osrith told herself. There was more for him to find if Ulf was about to betray her, for he had already thrown the coin bag to a Dane standing behind Gert. Fast dialogue between the two men made Gert stride to them, and Osrith listened to try to pick up any phrases, but it was unlike the Norsiric Thurgilson had taught her that Osrith could discern nothing, and instead, readied herself to pull tagged seeks as soon as Ulf had let go. As panic rose in her throat, she had to get to Winchester. She must find her brother. Yet she didn't have to use the blade. Gert stepped between the Dane and his brother, pushing Osrith away, appearing to chide his brother and snap angrily at Heston at turns while pointing to Osrith past Ulf's chest. But the Danish leader still stared at Osrith, looking at her body as she stood there, warrior-clad. Then, glancing back to Gert, he stepped away, stepping past Ulf as his men boarded the fishing boat, taking the catch, and throwing the empty wooden buckets back to the boat. No money had changed hands, the Frisian brothers had been looted. Gert watched the Danish boat sail away as the bright, warm spring day opened around them like a yellow daisy before turning to his brother, who was tidying the buckets and the nets. He said nothing for a while, his frame blocking the view of the Wessex coast before turning back and surveying the loss. Ulf, meanwhile, took the fishing net that Osrith was about to untangle and hid it away from at the prow. It was then that his brother turned and bore down on him, fist high. Gert punched his brother in the face, causing him to topple over the edge of the fishing boat. Osrith gasped and made to hurry over as huge, frantic splashes came from the port side, but Gert stood in her way. He took Osrith's shoulders, one in each hand, said something quickly but looking into her eyes, trying to convey reassurance. Then, he took up her blanket and the tangled net. Ulf heaved himself out of the sea eventually, looking at Osrith through narrow eyes as he slithered into the bottom of the boat, but said nothing to her, and the uncomfortable silence persisting as Gert raised the iron cross spike and then the boat's sail and headed west. It took 2 more days until the Frisians got to Hammock, Wessex's large fishing port. Ulf refused even to look at Osrith now, his face sporting a lump which would eventually bruise from his brother's thump. And Osrith just waited for them tie up along with the many other craft, large and small. Yet none of them appeared Danish. No animal figureheads adorned warship brows. It was the last kingdom of England to be truly free, different in character to Northumbria or Alba or Irian, a warmth, richness to the land, prosperous, rich. No wonder the Danes wanted it so badly. And Osrith suddenly felt a mantle fall from her mind, as if she could now see more brightly and clearer than before. She wasn't running from Alba, but striding with confidence to her kin, to the brother she had once glimpsed through a broken wooden palisade come to taunt their uncle with his mere existence. Yet Tagged still had her heart, even in death. Though he was deeply Christian, Osrith suspected that his core was pagan. A little like herself. He was a man who, in his heart, knew as if fact, that the Scythe were real. Osrith had done as the Morrigan had demanded of her, their oath to one another, in the land, on their way to Tara, and she, the Queen of the Scythe, had been there, as she was present, always. But the great Chaos Queen of the Irish didn't live here, in Wessex. None of the Scythe did. There was a surprising emptiness of spirit here in this southern kingdom that Osrith knew, now, to be their presence. Had they ever? Osrith wondered. The Druid, the bards had lived here once. But Osrith could no longer feel any presence of otherworldly spirits who lived beside the Irish Christianity in the north. That thought remained with Osrith as she watched Gert unload at the busy port what Heston the Dane had allowed them to keep, what he hadn't discovered in the panels at the boat's sides and the Frisian past baskets of eels brought from Gypswig to Ulf on the quay. Skate, Ray and Osrith's sleeping companion Flounder soon followed. Gathering her blanket and rolling it up in a leather cord, she peered out at the port, with its cobbled dragways where bundles of what looked like cloth were being pushed up it by 3 men in a wooden crate. Its vessel was large with pale wooden planks. Osrith had never seen a craft so large, and it looked as if the crew had a tough job ahead of them as more cargo of the same size and shape was also aboard. Gert, meanwhile, had begun a brisk trade in his stock from people gathering around him and Ulf, and he briskly pocketed copper coins and a few silver ones, clearing out his stock in less than an hour. Just her to leave now, Osrith thought, and she made to climb overboard, into the shallow, muddy water, and she waited for her feet to wet as she anticipated working out the way to Winchester. There were plenty of people to ask, she figured. But the splash did not come, and all of a sudden, Gert filled her vision as he carried her out to the wharf cobbles, lowering her down until her feet met them. A guilty flush came to her cheeks. He had prevented her being abducted by the Danes, and they had taken the Frisian silver she had given to them. They had brought her the length of the island of Britain, and had nothing to show for their protection of her. Behind her, Osrith noticed, Ulf ignored them, and she wondered about his hostility to her. Gert said nothing, and Osrith tried Anglish to thank him, which he clearly didn't understand. Osrith knew no Frisian, so she tried Norse and then succeeded with Cymric where she had failed with Gaelish. "My thanks," Osrith began, hesitating as she sought for the words, the right words, that conveyed weight enough for her gratitude. Then, she felt words in her throat that her mind did not intend her to utter. "What did you say to them? The Danes? Heston?" Gert's ice blue eyes sparkled, then his thick lips turned up at the corners to match but still said nothing. "They did not take me with them because of what you said," Osrith pressed. "You are possessed by the sea witch giantess Wakilt and you bring us the good catches and prosperity." He pointed a thick finger to her chest, then back to his boat. "I said if they should take you, Wakilt would drag the warship to the seabed and drown them all with her giant tail." Osrith did not mean to laugh. But that the straightforward Gert had concocted the story made her think he believed it. Perhaps he did. "Thank you," she said again. Mean words against his generosity. Gert said nothing, but watched her. And a thought occurred to Osrith. He had no silver. She must pay her way. Scrambling around in her clothing, Osrith produced a handful of silver from her jerkin. It was about half she had left over from the original bag which she had found in the rowing boat when she had fled Bibbenberg. But Gert pushed her hand away. "You go, Wakilt, where you will." And the Frisian boy, now young man, successful fish trader around the British coast turned and began his work again, collecting his empty baskets from the quay and striding back towards his boat. And they would leave, and here she was, Osrith of the Gales, of Alba, Irene and, of course, of Bibbenberg. Now, as the mid-springtime sun bathed her face, Osrith smiled, and began on her journey to where she last knew her brother to be, Winchester.